Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, and I'm a registered social worker with over 13 years of collective experience as a registered social worker and 5 years as a therapist. I specialize in narcissistic abuse as well as scapegoat recovery, and in this video I'm going to be covering the notion of what it really means when you go no contact and what are some of the typical experiences and steps that a scapegoat has to take within their journey to recovery. So when you go no contact with your family, it's likely the case that for many years you might have limited contact, and you might have done this subconsciously, like you might have moved away from them, or just perhaps you did it consciously in the sense that for many years you were waiting for that time to go to school or to university. Any way you could get distance from the family was something you were after. You either did it consciously or to some degree subconsciously, just in the sense that you didn't want the drama and you just knew that something was off. But as a scapegoat now, you've perhaps continued to go back to the family, believing that perhaps there could be change, focusing on the positive times and minimizing the negative. You've been through this cycle several times, and you could consider it being like the narcissistic abuse cycle within the family system, in the sense that usually there's idolization. So perhaps when you come home or when you're with your siblings for the first few days, things are very positive and they are perhaps flattering towards you or being very admirational towards you and showing admiration. And then usually what happens, and it I guess depends on the family, but at some point you're devalued. You're first put on a pedestal and then the rug is pulled underneath you, and you are left being discarded by your parents or by a parent or a sibling. It's usually very radical because in the idolization phase, you were elated, feeling loved and cared for, and believing it to be authentic and genuine. And yet, when the devaluation phase, it obviously appears, and it's such a stark difference from what you were experiencing with that person, and they show you an entirely different side of them. And this is the notion that within a narcissist, they have narcissistic injury, narcissistic rage. People talk about how you can see it in their eyes, this empty person, this empty vessel. It's shocking to the core. That's the discard phase, and typically that's when most people go no contact or limit contact. Perhaps it's been weeks and you've been struggling with, like at first you probably had a lot of shock and anger, but then it was perhaps, if you don't repeat the cycle in terms of acceptance, in terms of radically accepting the way in which your family is, or one of them is narcissistic, then it's likely the case that you'll continue in the cycle. I'll speak more about limiting contact and how that's different from stepping out of the cycle, but to some degree, anytime you're engaging with the family, you're going to have a level of being in that cycle if they're genuinely narcissistic, just because that's simply who they are and the way they operate. So in terms of the discard phase, there's the hoovering phase and the love bombing phase. This is when your family or parent is trying to hoover you back in. Perhaps they're sending messages to you, like text messages, and they're wanting to rope you back into the dynamic. So they never really address the underlying grievance, and it's the hall of mirrors. You felt harmed against within this narcissistic rage, narcissistic injury. They make a mountain out of a molehill. What seemed to be just a small grievance turns into this overwhelming outburst from them and this rage, and they typically will lash out. Every narcissist is different. It is exaggerated and not proportional to the actual issue. You're at home, things are going well, it's been positive with your parents or mom, you don't put the dishes away. And that very much bothers her, and she has this very extreme outburst towards you, and then continues to berate and put you down and accuse you perhaps of that you're no good, you're lazy, I knew that you wouldn't be anything, something like this. So they're very much extreme in their messaging and being verbally abusive towards you, and emotionally abusive. And perhaps the narcissist, if you're younger, maybe they've been physically abusive. But they have this incident, and for you, that's obviously a boundary that was crossed. And because they feel entitled to lash out this way to their nearest and dearest, because It's basically the notion is that they don't have any boundaries, so a narcissist is not a fully formed self. And so you can think about it's like their elbow. So let's say your elbow's not like getting in line, so you might try to straighten it out or something like this, right? So you see this arm as an extension of you. The same way with the narcissist in terms of the world, the what is, they merge with the world in the sense that a healthy ego separates from the world and individuates and is autonomous to themselves. And that's the tricky part, is that on the surface they can participate in the game of acting as though they're individuals. They operate based off fusing self with the world, particularly with their family. They'll project and have an emotional fusion. And so this goes back to Bowen in terms of his notion of the undifferentiated ego mass. They create roles and need you to get in line with the sense that they're in control and they're the ones who set the agenda and determine what is true. And there's no self-reflection of that, though, of course. It's just taken as a given. Growing up in this environment, that was a given. If you study science, you know there's the myth of the givens. Understanding these family dynamics, the given is they're in charge, entitled to say and do what they want. And they could care less in some degree about your reactions or way in which you stand up for yourself. That's tricky because they do care, but they also are entitled and they feel like that you're deserving of this treatment, particularly because they think that you've done something. And sometimes they pick up on things that you perhaps feel guilty about, or they know that you have a weakness or sensitivity around, and weaponize that, you internalize that. It could be the case that you start to get caught up in a certain complex and start to be neurotic around a certain issue. And it could be anxiety, but various ways in which they'll weaponize your psychological issues against you. Probably because they are a product of that environment and the family, they're responsible and projected onto you. That's where it's tricky, like how much is it them versus you. But for the most part, there's the notion that within the time that you've set a boundary and you went no contact or limited contact, you're in this hoovering love bombing phase, perhaps believing if you communicate in a different way, like first there's the shock and then there's the grappling with it. It's like you've gained some knowledge. And Lindsay Gibson's work, she talks about emotionally mature parents. And so if someone's not fully narcissist and perhaps they just have narcissistic style or type, then they could perhaps, there's some ways in which you could communicate with them and maybe there can be some reconciliation. But I'm speaking more about the parents who really have a pathology in terms of narcissism and don't take any ownership or responsibility. So in that case, you've been through this well in this cycle many times, and that's the tricky part too, is that you have to let go and analyze what's going on, what is motivating your parents' behavior. That's usually when you're going limited contact. A lot of the advice is the gray rock method, staying more neutral. Once you understand that your parents are looking for narcissistic supply, it has to do with them. You have to grieve that family you thought you had isn't what you thought. This goes down to that loneliness, or that very much insecurity and that being betrayed. And so that's the original wound, I would say, or betrayal that occurs. And usually when you go no contact and you've made that decision, what you're grieving is betrayal. It's not just this sense that you've set a boundary. This reminds you, I think, of all those times where your family, your parents weren't there for you. You were looking for the mutuality, but it was always a pseudo-reality and a pseudo-mutuality with them. And this pseudo-normalcy of the family was taken as a given, and the siblings, the golden child and the flying monkeys and the whole apparatus around convinced you this was normal. As you wake up and you become more aware and you've gained knowledge and you've come to terms with what you're dealing with, so you have radical acceptance, you're working on this grievance, limited beliefs. As a scapegoat, you had to own and take the collective shadow. It's about integrating your own shadow and changing those around. So you can consider it like cognitive behavior therapy. So let's say your family treated you as a garbage can, you're likely to hold some of that negativity and believe it to some degree. It's about naming those beliefs. So, I'm worthless. But you could just reframe it being like, my parents or my family told me I was worthless, but I am very much capable and someone worthy of respect and dignity. So you reframe it and you empower the projection of the shadow, and so you integrate the shadow. And so with Carl Jung, he talked about more unhealthy or unconscious people, they don't even are not aware of their shadow, so they go around projecting onto the world believing that it's others when in fact it's to do with them. And I think we all do this to a degree. Carl Jung, that was just the notions that through therapy and psychology you could do shadow work, integrating the shadow. There's a notion of the 3-2-1 process. I first learned it from Ken Wilber in his book Integral Theory. He talks about the 3-2-1 process. Let's say you react to somebody very strongly, so you have a very strong emotion, and let's say it's a dream and you have a monster chasing you. And so in the dream, the monster is an other, so it's a third person, it's something outside of you, chasing you. And then when you wake up, you're obviously fearful and you probably have a lot of sweat maybe. But to do shadow work would be to consider that monster that was chasing you is an aspect of you, or is you in some sense. And you dialogue with that monster and you ask, and so through that you have a second person relationship. Ultimately you own that monster, believing that is ultimately you or a part of you that was chasing you in some sense, or what is that representing you that you're fearful of. Not everyone's going to react that way. People won't get overly charged about someone overweight, but if someone's struggling with their own weight, they project to make themselves feel better by putting others down, seeing it as a fault in others. It's easier for them to not have to face themselves. So that's what obviously in an unhealthy way they do to the children, is they project onto the children. And so part of going no contact and moving forward is grieving that scapegoat role and the projection of the family, and the shadow projection of the family. But how that makes you incredibly strong and resilient, through integrating your own shadow, you're integrating the projection from the family and what was said about you. So I think I would encourage you to consider core beliefs, so limited beliefs, and empower them, and so make them, see them as a strength. And so your wounds become as a wounded healer archetype that Carl Jung would speak about. So often the scapegoat is often creative and all the things that, and can be vulnerable and show strength, and because it's like a clean mirror, and so it's something that has more awareness, usually that child. And so the family and narcissistic parents project onto that child to disown their shadow. Let's say you go no contact and you're an adult, you work on your shadow, integrate those projections and empower them, have more honest and authentic beliefs about who you are. You live in defiance of the family and of the narcissist. That's the only way to move forward. If you've accepted your parent is a narcissist, it's tricky to have any form of exposure to them, because each time you'll continue that cycle, that narcissistic abuse cycle, and they'll pull you into their orbit, and there'll be a lack of differentiation, and it's going to be just undermining to you and to what you want to build for your own life and individuate. You have to determine that for yourself, and it's tricky because I honestly think that obviously family is important, but you have to have your life and your family based on, I'm talking about your family of origin, based off of truth and of mutual respect. But when that's non-existing, obviously you just have to walk away and, I would say, grieve. And this is, when grieving, it's very complex, I would say, in the sense that you're grieving what you didn't have in that relationship that you thought you had with the family, and your biology, and just everything about our development attaches us to our family, regardless of whether they're healthy or not. That's the confusion. Biologically, this was and is our family, but emotionally and psychologically, they weren't there for you because of you could consider it intergenerational trauma. So the book, It's Not You, explores this and how it gets passed through the generations. But yeah, there's a notion of disenfranchised grieving before they pass their death, and you're also dealing with their projections, and you're also recognize that most people aren't going to understand it likely, or friends might even encourage you, or even professionals or therapists can perhaps tell you that maybe you should go contact or something like this, or maybe your parents aren't as bad. But this is the tricky road you have to follow and lead. Ultimately, I wanted to cover in this video understanding going no contact, the narcissistic abuse cycle. I pulled in thinkers like Carl Jung, Sam Vatkin, as well as Lindsay Gibson and Jay Reid, as well as Bowen, to understand this dynamic and give you different lenses and approaches to consider. So I would encourage you to consider shadow work, and there's the 3-2-1 process I would encourage you to look into. You can consider writing down some scripts in terms of some of these limited beliefs, and then just doing a simple exercise of reframing them and framing them more in a positive or empowering way. But then also coming back to some of the strengths that you do have as if you were the scapegoat. So if you did like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.